Today's presentation will be more of a discussion. It will be led by RP3C Chair Steve Krahn and RP3C Vice Chair Brandon Chisholm. I will let them explain the purpose of today's meeting as well as the format for discussion. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Pat. All right, Brandon, why don't we bring up the slides? So as Pat mentioned, we intend for this to be a interactive dialogue. There we go. All right. So in our continued interaction with standards development groups within ANS, we've identified that the incorporation of risk-informed and performance-based concepts could benefit from additional dialogue on possibly the meaning of risk-informed and performance-based, even from the start. So the intent of this meeting and possibly a couple of future meetings is to gather that input. Why don't we go ahead and hit the next slide? So I'll briefly go over the logistics for today's discussion, the goals and objectives for the discussion. I'll hand off to Brandon to discuss some basics of the guidance document that the RP3C has out there to assist people in evaluating how to incorporate risk-informed, performance-based approaches into standards. And then we will turn it around to you all for an interactive conversation on your experiences, your understanding of risk-informed, performance-based, and what you view as either the challenges or successes till date. And then we'll do a wrap-up when we reach the end of the dialogue. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, we're interested in gathering the input from you, the user community, for risk-informed, performance-based concepts, and how we can better support implementation of those attributes into standards, and hopefully then those approaches into the way we do business in the nuclear community. We'll appreciate your cooperation and patience as we try to move through this discussion and try to accommodate viewpoints from as many people as possible. Brandon, who's much more IT savvy than I am, will direct traffic on the chat function. So if your preference is to provide us written input, please make sure to use the chat function. And Brandon will actively monitor that during the dialogue and make sure that all y'all who are on the chat function are getting your input inserted at applicable points in the dialogue. If you do desire to come off mute, it'd be nice if you can provide some context for your comment as you make the comment. We will try to address raised hands as we identify them and in the order that we're able to identify them. This is just the start of this dialogue, or it's a continuation of the dialogue, really. And both Brandon and I are available via email to continue and address comments that you may have. Next slide. Our present priorities on RP3C is to meet our responsibilities for identification and oversight of the development and implementation of risk-informed, performance-based approaches in ANS standards. These principles are applicable to the pretty much the variety of activities that are covered by ANS standards, but they're not necessarily applicable to all of them. And that's why we're available to have an ongoing conversation about their incorporation. The committee also has responsibility for training and knowledge sharing about our risk-informed performance-based principles. And the community of practice is one of our major tools and why we're using it today to garner feedback. Our near-term priorities on the committee are to improve understanding of the principles of risk-informed performance-based methods and approaches, to improve involvement and interaction with the ANS Standards Committee and Standards Working Group on the subject of risk-informed performance-based implementation. And overall, because we're great believers in the standards process, we desire to improve overall participation in the ANS and the functions of the ANS standards committees. Next slide.
Ready for me to take over?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. So I won't take too long. Just got a couple more slides here to talk about some of the context of the products that RP3C has produced previously and also are still available for your reference. So I dropped the link in the chat, and you can see the website URL up here, or you can just Google ANS RP3C, and it'll take you to this fancy website that we've got here, where you can find, we've got the links to the community of practice recordings, as well as some of these documents here under the RP3C document header. And so I think the major focus here, as we think about shaping what we're doing in the near term and moving forward, and again, producing information and guidance that is helpful to in particular, the ANS standards development community. This guidance document that you can see here in 2022 is actually a revision of the original revision of the guidance document that was issued in 2019. So this revision that was issued in 2022 is for interim trial use for folks in the ANS standards community as they are putting together their working groups or as they are conducting the work in developing the standard. And we'll talk a little bit, I believe, on the next slide about what's in that document. But in addition to the guidance document itself, you can see here that we have part one of the training. The slides are the link above the presentation recording, and then the presentation recording is about a 1 hour YouTube video of Jim O'Brien walking through the guidance that's in that guidance document. And then we also have slides for part two of the training that is an application, an example and discussion of considerations for applying the information that's in that guidance document. Again, all of these are publicly available, and you can get to them if you're like me. I generally lose files when I save them, so it's helpful to know where they are online. And so again, as we move forward and talk about things that are in here or aren't in here, or what should or shouldn't be in there, what is or isn't helpful, then I think we also want to remember that these community of practices, we've got folks here today that represent a wide variety of perspectives and experience. This group offers an opportunity for us to get input from organizations, efforts, individuals, examples that will inform kind of what is the cutting edge of risk-informed and or performance-based approaches and attributes. Obviously, we've been using these to socialize new ideas, but I think we can also use this forum to garner, again, y'all's input on where we should be looking, what we should be aware of, just in case we haven't brought it to our attention yet. So the meat of the RP3C document is here in sections 4, 5, and 6 of the guidance document, as well as appendices alpha through echo. We have a process for utilizing RP3C to support the incorporation of RIPB approaches. And so I do see that Greg Hudson in the chat had asked, is RP3C, is our priority updating existing standards or creating new standards? And the answer is both, Greg. We are, so RP3C, just to be clear, is not a consensus committee within the ANS standards organization. And so we are a resource for those consensus committees and their working groups while they are working on either the development of a new standard or the revision or update or maintenance of an existing standard. So, I think that the answer in terms of where we can find the most value does kind of depend on exactly where you're looking in standard space. What is the technology? How recently was the standard created? And also what is the appetite for the end users in terms of the application of RIPB?
Kind of another way to address that question is we have gotten requests from both groups, from both people who are in the process of revising an existing standard and people who are developing a new standard. Right.
And so to that end, also Appendix Alpha talks about the roles and responsibilities of RP3C. Kind of jumping back here into a little bit more of the technical content, there's a discussion of the objectives of what is the goal and what are the benefits of the use of RIPB approaches and principles, and then a discussion of kind of here are the fundamental building blocks for how to incorporate this into a standard. And then we have some examples in Bravo, Charlie, and Delta using the maintenance rule as one example. There is a crafted kind of simple example to really illustrate the basic concepts and how they can be employed, as well as some excerpts of RIPB guidance from various ANS standards in the ANS Standards Cinematic Universe. And then there are some frequently asked questions in Appendix Echo. So this is the last slide before I will go on mute, and I will be monitoring the chat and directing traffic. So I hope everybody brought their thinking caps today. So really, as we look forward to things that we have at least proposed in the near term for RP3C, is looking at what's in the guidance document and improving upon that, right? Continuous improvement and making sure the products that we're delivering are as useful and as used as possible. And so I think we've gotten some feedback that refining the definitions of key terms, I think that performance-based is one that has been tricky in terms of using what's written in the document per se, for folks to understand how that applies, doesn't apply to what they have, and how how to separate that out even from risk informed. I mean, I'm guilty of it myself here. A lot of the times that you see PB, it has RI right in front of it, but they are separate terms and they are able to be separated. And just because you use one doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use the other. And so to that end, showing some more examples, whether they be hypothetical or actual, I do think that actual examples are sometimes more helpful, and we have the opportunity as we help out some of these working groups in their activities to hopefully leverage that and maybe incorporate that as an illustration of this is what it looked like before and this is what we ended up with. And again, I think that the questions that we're looking for input from y'all, but feel free to take the conversation wherever it makes sense. We have a sense of who are the interested and informed stakeholders in risk-informed and performance-based standards and guidance, but we certainly don't pretend to know everything. And so hearing about some efforts, individuals, organizations that folks might not be as aware of, I think is to the benefit, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel if somebody's already out there with their own wheel that we can, share and use to help benefit the ANS standards development community. I will talk in just a second about an idea that I've got and would be interested in folks' reactions to kind of a theme for a series of community of practice sessions. And then I mentioned the training. I think that after the guidance document has been updated and we think that we've got sufficient content to go ahead and update it, I think that there also may be an effort to update that training. And of course, understanding what folks are using there, what they do like, what they don't like is relevant to us thinking about the most efficient way to go about that effort as well. So last comment here over on the right-hand side of the slide is, recognizing that ANS is not the only standards development organization, so not even in the nuclear industry, but certainly looking broader, there are other folks that have similar goals, similar processes to what we are using. And so I think that it might be an interesting idea to use the community of practice sessions to invite folks from other standards development organizations for them to talk about how they think about what they have as formalized process, what they have as informalized process, formal references, informal references for incorporating risk-informed and or performance-based elements into their guidance or their standards. I do think that this complements the ARC-SIC, the Advanced Reactor Codes and Standards Committee for risk-informed and performance-based approaches. And of course, I think that it benefits not just RP3C, but all the folks that participate in these sessions live as well as view them later on. And I've just listed a bunch of acronyms and abbreviations here for folks that I know are developing content. I'm sure that there are some other letters that we could organize in different ways that also would be relevant here. But I think that is the end of my talking. So Steve, I will turn it back over to you. I don't see any specific hands up or comments in the chat, so I don't know if you want to ask a specific question first.
Well, if people don't volunteer questions, I certainly know people whose names are on the right-hand side of this box, so I could call on them for their thoughts. But what were thanks,
We've
John.
got a hand up from
Okay.
Lon
Okay.
Paulson.
All right. Fire away.
Yeah, I'm a former chair of the Nuclear Criticality Safety Division, and I'm currently involved in several ANS 8 series national consensus standards as they're undergoing revision. And I'm sure Doug, I'm also a voting member of Subcommittee 8. I'm sure Doug Bowen, who's our Subcommittee 8 chair currently, has reached out to you and maybe has some insight that I don't have. But in the forward of our ANS 8 series standards, which is on nuclear criticality safety, we've been tasked with, the working group has or has not incorporated risk-informed and or performance-based requirements in this standard. And I don't know of your familiarity with the ANS 8 series standards, but we're a bit perplexed as to whether risk-informed performance-based applies or does not apply. I will say that our standards are written to basically allow either DOE or NRC licensees to stand up NCS programs that will prevent a criticality accident outside of reactors. And so, just, in simple terms, it's clearly, if you do this and meet these guidelines and or I would think performance-based requirements outlined in our standards, and you prevent an accident, then we could at least acknowledge that we're performance-based. Now, it may be that you're coming at it from a PRA, PSA perspective. Most facilities use either qualitative. Most facilities use qualitative. My facility here in Wilmington uses what's called a quantitative risk assessment. And so we do have an overall likelihood calculation that is mathematically derived to give us a highly unlikely threshold per 10 CFR 70, for example. So there's qualitative, there's quantitative arguments, but we're not PRA. So with that said, would you classify us in one bucket or the other? Are we or are we not? I'm trying to get a straight answer, and it's been several years, and I've yet to get one.
So remembering that our job is not to judge your standards, but provide assistance. I would certainly agree with the first part of your statement that they do tend to be performance-based. I mean, you do issue criticality safety evaluations, which are updated based on a facility's experience, correct?
Well, yeah, each fissile material process application has an associated documented nuclear criticality safety evaluation, which does have a hazards assessment that is performed in accordance with the site facility practices and procedures.
And there are things that could help the performance-based nature of that could be whether or not those procedures are reviewed on a regular basis for enhancements.
Well, design change control or configuration management dictates whether a change to an existing documented analysis is necessary. Depends on the extent of the change, but clearly nuclear safety is involved in the review and approval of design changes that may or may not impact the safety bases, authorization bases of the site or facility.
So, that is a performance-based attribute that you could take credit for as part of the performance-based approach. It is not. So you also mentioned PRA, PSA. It's not the intent of the risk-informed performance-based initiative to impose probabilistic risk assessment on standards where it is not presently required and could not and may in fact not be helpful to the implementation of the standards. So that is a question that we get from just about every working group that we interface with, and so that is clearly a clarification that I need to get out there as part of the process. So that's helpful feedback. Go ahead.
Well, Lon, so just to add a little bit more here, I do think that one of the things that, in addition to interacting directly with the working groups, one of the things that's been on my mind is kind of thinking about how and so maybe this is a bit of a prompt for other folks if they are aware of somewhere that maybe this is documented or where there is a good discussion of this. There is kind of the trade-off between using some of the more flexible risk-informed and performance-based pieces, but you still want to maintain some predictability and stability, right? So one of the examples in the ANS 8 series, to my understanding, is the criticality accident alarm system. I believe that's 8.3. My understanding is that some of the requirements for essentially the justification for needing or not needing that particular piece of equipment was made a little bit more, I would say, performance-based. There's certainly a risk-informed attribute to it, but also considerations of other things like cost-benefit analysis. And so I think that understanding in particular how that has been received by the criticality safety community can help us to understand, where are the elements that we can kind of focus in on to provide the guidance that provides additional flexibility while hopefully not removing too much of the predictability and stability of those types of standards and guidance.
And if you take a step back, qualitatively describing, risk is a hazard times probability equation. If you use an understanding of hazards to grade the approach in a standard, that is a way of risk informing them. So I believe criticality safety standards are adjusted based on the nature of the material in the process facility being either the nature or amount of material being dealt with. Is that a correct assumption? I'm shooting from memory here.
Well, certainly if there is sufficient S&M, special nuclear material, at your facility to cause a criticality, there is a threshold, and once you get above it, in the NRC side of the house, you're in the world of criticality safety, and so you have to meet all the requirements. You have to meet the performance requirements and prevent a high consequence event, which is an inadvertent or a criticality accident. But I mean, all of our analyses that we perform at the facilities, the whole idea behind them is to demonstrate for each credible accident sequence you have established. In my world, it's IROFs. In DOE side, it's TSRs, tech spec requirements that prevent the accident sequence. And so the hazards evaluation is inherent in the analysis and the documentation thereof. And so it is a major emphasis is to evaluate each credible accident sequence, process node by process node throughout your facility. So you're saying if we do the hazards eval, that's a risk informed, and if we provide guidance, it's performance based. So it seems like we are risk informed and performance based.
And go ahead, Brandon.
Oh, Steve, I was just going to say we do have a couple more hands, so if you want to wrap up your thoughts.
No, I mean, I think this, and there's also things like segmentation that are available, adjustments, available tools as part of risk informing criticality safety approaches, I believe, as well. Correct?
I'm not familiar with segmentation. I don't know what you mean.
Segmentation, developing barriers that clearly separate nuclear materials so that you can handle them separately from a criticality safety evaluation process instead of having to lump them. Well, anyway, we're not doing criticality safety evaluations here.
Yeah. But I appreciate your comments and feedback. Yeah. I'll get it back to Doug, and we'll continue the effort to whether we are or not going to fold this in as a statement.
And Lon, towards the end of this, I'll probably wrap up. I think I've got a couple of topics to consider further. So I'll kind of recap that towards the end to make sure we captured some of the stuff that y'all might be interested in. Prasad, I believe you are next.
Yeah. Thank you, Brandon. In response to what Lon said, I haven't had a chance when I was chair of RP3C to interact with Lon Paulson, I don't think. If I did, I'm not recollecting, and I apologize. But for a long time, I've been making the case to the ANS 8 Consensus Committee that adopting a formal performance-based approach as defined by the Commission in the SRM to SECI 98-144, which is the basis for the Appendix B in the guidance document. So adopting a formal definition such as what's in the guidance document offers a means for the ANS standards to be able to tell NRC that our standards, by that I mean ANS standards, for criticality safety are performance-based, but not necessarily risk-informed. And I think having a formal basis to make that kind of a statement is very useful. And, some of us know that we are involved in a discussion on making a comment on Part 53, where if this kind of argument had been part of the record, then I think we would have had a stronger basis. Right now, the fact is that there's another standard, 1913, and Bob Youngblood can speak to that, I think, in a more informed way. But the fact is that we do try to make the point that there are many ANS standards that are, in fact, performance-based, but because there is so much confusion about what exactly are the attributes of performance-based approaches, people are unable to justify a claim because many people make the claim that something is performance-based and base it on their own definition of what is performance-based. My own feeling is that, we should all adopt a standard definition of risk-informed performance-based based on the Commission's white paper in the SRM to SECI 98-144, and that is, in fact, adopted in the guidance document. So I'm just making a plug for using the guidance document more than it has been used before. So.
Okay, thank you. Brandon, why don't you go ahead and read out your potential topics, and hopefully they will excite some more commentary.
Yeah, and we've got, I think Bob's next, and then we'll go to Greg, but just in case folks can't see the chat, some of the things that I've kind of synthesized here is kind of a discussion of the various degrees of implementation, whether that's RI or PB or RIPB together, discussion of performance-based without risk-informed, kind of to that initial point, a little bit more of examples of what that can look like and kind of the optionality, and then considerations for flexibility versus stability in the guidance. Bob, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, yeah, I think the early discussions of PB did stress, or at least make it fairly clear, that you can do PB without RI. But that isn't why I raised my hand. First of all, I think I think we all believe in terminology being important, but I want to give you guys a gold star for really focusing on it, because I do think that it needs to evolve. I've been through several eras of nuclear regulation, and we all have different history, and we all react differently to the history we lived through. And I'm recalling the Chairman Jackson era when the phrase risk-informed was born. And in those days, it seemed to me there was a culture war between PRA advocates and PRA opponents. And it was important in those days to sort of reassure the PRA opponents that they still had a place at the table. You know, it was important to have PRA in one hand and all the deterministic stuff in the other, and everybody should, you know, move forward and sing Kumbaya. And I know people who still quote Reg Guide 1174 as if it defined risk informed, even though it tells you have to stick to the old requirements. And that brings me to it's been a long time since the mid 90s. It's been a long time since 1998, and 98-144 was surely written in some part years before that. And the thing I'd like to point out is that licensing modernization project seems to me to go well beyond the old rhetoric in how it uses risk concepts. You know, it doesn't tell you to, by the way, follow Part 50 while you're doing the LMP. And so I'd like to see a definition of risk informed that was less tied to the mid 90s. You know, just to go back to the earlier discussion, it seems to me that if you're thinking methodically and systematically about scenarios, and if you're at all consequence driven, which I believe, you know, if I follow the discussion, I think both of those things are true of the criticality work, then I would be happy to call it risk informed. In the case of the reactor startup physics testing, I think the case for performance-based was clear, but that the nature of the problem made consideration of scenarios a bit more important. I mean, a bit more confusing, because you can imagine errors having been made in the safety analysis, but it's more it's just sort of clumsier to try to think about enumerating the scenarios that you're going to prevent. But my sense of the criticality story that was being told is that they did think methodically about scenarios. Anyway, so my bottom line, I'd like to see a definition of risk informed that really recognized the way things are going to be under a remotely LMP-like world. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg, you've been patiently waiting with your hand up.
Oh, that's okay. Just sort of a follow-up thought to Prasad and Bob's comments, but it would it would seem to me that there are four categories of standards: those that are risk-informed, those that are performance-based, those that are risk-informed and performance-based, and those that are neither. And so if one buys that approach or that philosophy, then it would seem that perhaps a starting point would be to develop a procedure for categorizing standards. And, in developing such a procedure would really, I think, as everybody seems to be supporting, would really provide a focus on defining the criteria or characteristics or whatever of each of those four categories, since you're going to have to um, um, pigeonhole all standards into one of those four buckets. Another related thought to that is um, my guess is that there's not going to be a one size fits all approach to defining definitions of those four categories. And so, in thinking about that, perhaps in going through this process, there may be a different definition of risk informed and performance, those four categories. There may be slightly different definitions for each consensus committee, because the nature of the standards, the topics addressed by each consensus committee are different. So, food for thought.
Hey, Greg, just as a bit of a follow-up, because I know that you are involved in some of the ASME stuff. Is there any sort of, I know that SCORA exists within ASME, but is there any sort of analogous structure in terms of categorizing the standards that are under development or guidance documents that exist? Or is it largely, is that process within ASME kind of just relying upon the folks in the individual working groups?
That's let me just say that I'm not aware of such a process. But as you well know, ASME is a huge organization. But I'm not aware of such a process.
So I think Ralph Hill is on the line. Ralph, you're intimately involved in ASME standards work. Is there any? Do they have any sort of categorization system that they use to explain the nature of their standards?
Not really. They have the boiler code, which is which are the ones we're most familiar with from a designer's standpoint. But they also have other series of codes that deal with many of the subjects that are not directly related to boiling, B&B, things like that. B&B 50 is its own standard, and there's another board that's responsible for that versus the Board on Nuclear Codes and Standards. So, but there's no really categorization that I'm aware of. And they haven't done a lot, I think, in their risk informed performance based other than the plant systems design standard is the only one I'm aware
of. Okay. Thanks, Ralph.
Well, if I can just add a couple of thoughts to that, Steve.
Sure, Greg.
One of the what could arguably is a unique characteristic of ANS is that they have defined a mission to update standards to reflect risk-informed performance-based characteristics and established an organization to fulfill that mission. So, frankly, part of my thinking behind this is just putting my project manager hat on and you got an objective, and you or Brandon, put it on one of the first slides. There's the objective of incorporating risk-informed performance-based characteristics into ANS standards. So that's the objective. That's the develop a project plan to stepwise achieve that objective. And that I was suggesting earlier, perhaps the first step in that is developing a categorization approach. But anyhow, food for thought.
That's helpful. And it is part of the overall thrust to modernize the standards of the ANS too. Uh, but John, you have your hands up, please.
So I think there's going to be a lot of logistical issues trying to categorize because, like, I think of NQA1, there's now an appendix in there for how to implement 5069. So that's arguably a risk-informed performance-based appendix within that standard. There's still a bunch of very strict regulatory requirements. There's still a lot of prescription. So it's a prescriptive standard with some risk-informed performance-based pieces in it, and that's going to be true of a lot of these, right? Like you can incorporate risk-informed and performance-based concepts into standards up into the point that the regulations let you, and then you're stuck with a bunch of prescription. So I don't know. It's not going to be a clear line for almost any standard that I can think of.
It's a fair observation. I mean, the reason we write standards is to regularize performance in a given area. So part of any standard are going to be requirements. But so a good insight and the reference to 5069 is a good one. We can probably use as an example. So, John, thanks for the suggestion.
And
Ralph,
one.
I would just offer that I don't agree with John that the NQA1 appendix, or I forget what it's called, but I'm familiar with it, is written for performance-based. It's just how do you adapt NQA1 to use it for low safety significant? That's all it is.
but that is
It's really just special.
insight.
It's special treatment. No, it's not risk insight. It's just special treatment. Somebody else has done the risk evaluation, determined it's low safety significant. If they determine it's low safety significant, you can use this in lieu of the full NQA1. It's a special treatment. That's all.
That is something that I think it would be good to get clarity on, right? Because like IEEE has their 1819 standard. Is that a risk-informed performance-based standard or not? I guess based on Ralph's comment, he would argue that it's not, that you do the classification elsewhere.
I'm sorry, John. I'm not sure if 1819 is the one I'm familiar with, but I know there's an IEEE 1819 that talks about it's a risk-informed performance-based safety classification process. So they do have one. I'm not sure if that's the right number.
I think we're talking about the same one. But it's implementing 5069 for the most part, just with more guidance for electrical.
Yeah, but it's actually a process. And the NQA1, it just takes a process. Somebody's already determined it's low safety significant, and then you can use that appendix or part of 50 NQA1 versus a full NQA1 program. It's like I say, it's just a special treatment of 5069 for low safety significant. Whereas the IEEE is a whole process, very similar to a lot of similarity to what we're trying to do in 30.2 and what we do in the Plant Systems Design Standard.
So Ralph, you're urging that to be risk informed, you have to have more than two categories?
That's not a matter of categories. You need to go risk informed. Well, I'm not going to say I can't define what risk informed is. I really can't. I wouldn't venture one off the top of my head because there are different processes that all look at basically other than just deterministic solutions. You're looking at the probability and consequences an event will occur, and that's how you risk inform it. And for NQA1, I'm just saying that evaluation is done outside of NQA1. And once you determine that it is low safety significance, then you could use that part of NQA1 in lieu of the full NQA1. So it's just a variation of special treatment for quality.
So I think, and this goes back to one of the things that kind of Greg was mentioning, and, I think Bob was even getting to this. I think one of the pieces here that bears consideration is kind of the extent of the incorporation of some of these different attributes. So I know that Greg had mentioned maybe 4 categories of standards, but this is one of the things that I was also interested to see if anybody was aware of, any sort of references or discussions or the basically the menu options along the path that may, even lead to some of these different definitions of risk informed based on the discipline. And I think that to be clear, I don't think that the guidance document is needing to go be completely deleted and restarted, right? I think that the conversation that is in there about the attributes, I think lends itself to the ability to take a so-called definition, break it down into a couple different pieces and say, maybe it doesn't meet all 3 of these criteria, but it meets these 2 criteria. And so we do incorporate risk insights. Is that risk informed? Is that not? Maybe that's a question that we need to, come up with an answer for. But I think that one of the things that the guidance document does do well is present kind of the characterization as a function of various attributes, and not saying that it necessarily needs to be all or nothing in those cases. Prasad?
Brandon, I want to make sure that people are aware that this categorization, as Greg mentioned, is not a new idea. In fact, it is part of the guidance document in an indirect way, because one of the basic documents on which the guidance document is based is NUREG BR 0303. And NUREG BR 0303 formally has this diagram with the 4 categories exactly as Greg identified. It calls it the conventional approach, the risk-informed approach, the performance-based approach, and the risk-informed and performance-based approach, And so that follows what the commission in 98-144, even though Bob Youngblood thinks it's very old and we ought to do something more recent, the fact is that is really where all of these have already been really clarified in my mind. And if it needs to be improved, then I would say, yes, that's where the guidance document can be improved. So,
Okay, and Greg, you have posted a comment about the SMART matrix. You want to quickly talk about the SMART matrix?
Sorry, that was me replying to
sorry.
Greg in the chat. No, I mean we can
sorry.
transition to wrapping up after this because we got about 5 minutes. But I will just say, Greg had mentioned, kind of having a way to track the implementation of risk-informed and performance-based in support of the mission and basically the objective and the charter of RP3C under the ANS Standards Board to modernize and incorporate those attributes to the extent practicable. And so, we do have the PINs. I don't know what that acronym stands for, but, as part of tracking basically the process of developing or revising a standard, there's a section in there that says, will RI and or PB attributes be incorporated? And so as that standard goes through, it kicks it into basically being tracked if the answers are yes there. during the development process, and then they're made aware of the availability of RP3C. And then in addition to that, some of the stuff under the SPART matrix, which is at the higher level for the standards board, is also being tracked. But I think we've got about 3 minutes left here. So Steve, why don't you go ahead and wrap us up here?
Okay. Well, I want to get Ralph. You suggested sharing your screen momentarily. Is there? Do you want to provide the context for that offer?
Yeah, it's pertinent to John's comment on the INC and as being a process. It'll just take me a minute to share it with you.
Okay, Brandon, do you know how to enable that?
He just did. So,
okay.
Thank you, Brandon. So we developed this as part of the work we're doing for 30.2. Basically, it shows a design development, conceptual, preliminary, and detailed design. But the key point, we mapped that INC standard down against the process flow where it actually fits in very well. We've done a similar matching for LMP, but just want to, I know you may not be able to see it really well, basic design, initial list of functions, assignment of functions, final list of functions, identification of INC system allegation function, and then it goes to the classification process. So my point, John, is it's a process to do that. NQA1 is not got a process to it. It just, once somebody determines it's low safety significant, then you can use this part of NQA1 versus the full NQA1. That's why I said special treatment. So I'll be glad to share this with anyone who might be interested in it. So.
Yeah, why don't you share it with Brandon and I, and we can further distribute it. All right, Brandon. So this is the beginning of the conversation. We are not going to take over all of the community of practice for this conversation because we still want to be having opportunities for people to share their experience in risk informing their work. And we will have a presentation from EPRI next month on their work associated with risk informing seismic standards. So we appreciate all of you bearing with us and being being great on commenting and sharing your thoughts. And we look forward to we will send out the results of this sharing, and we will schedule another one maybe in the April or May timeframe. So I thank all of you for your time and your generosity with your thoughts, and hope that you have a good weekend. And next month's meeting is going to be an hour earlier. Sorry, I should have, that is to meet our speaker's schedule. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve and Brandon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right. Have a good weekend.